I'll never forget the first time I was told to be quiet. I was no more than 6 years old at my grandmother's house, and I had just collided face first with a wall. Now, mind you, yes, I was doing things that I was told not to do. But after that collision, face bloody, teeth falling out of my mouth, I'm crying, I'm screaming, and I hear my grandmother say, "Stop your eyes," which translated means be quiet. And that moment has been reinforced so many times throughout my life that I don't even remember when I started silencing my pain. I just knew that that's the way that I always dealt with things. So welcome to Noted. I'm Julia Gould, and this is a series where I unpack the topics that keep us stuck and scare us from making bold changes. With each episode, I hope to dig into a topic that is prevalent in my own life, take a look at the research, and try to figure out what we can do about it. So if you're like me and you're curious about why you do what you do and what you can do different, this one's for you. So today I want to talk about self-silencing. Last week I was in a business meeting and I had a very difficult time finding my voice. Initially, I heard my business partners say something that was incorrect. And I knew that it was incorrect, but I was scared to speak up. Now, ultimately I did, because I realized that I have something valuable to say and I should say it. But a younger version of myself would have just said nothing. So I became very curious about why I was scared initially to speak up. So I went looking for research to figure out what the hell is going on. And what I found was very interesting. There's a lot of research that has been done on the topic of self-silencing. The most foundational is work that was done by Dr. Dana Crowley Jack. This was in 1991, where she studied women in different circumstances: battered women's shelters, colleges, treatment facilities. And what she found was that because we as women, that we largely define ourselves by our relationships, we have the tendency to suppress our own thoughts and feelings in order to maintain harmony and connection in our relationships. And what she also found, unfortunately, is that suppression is highly correlated with depression. And since 1991, her study has been replicated across various cultures, professions, and by and large, the research supports that self-silencing shows up predominantly in women. And even though self-silencing happens across culture, the reasons why we do it might look a little different. So of course, I wanted to understand the Black experience, and I came across some work by Dr. Jewel Scott. And what she did was interviewed, I think it was about 15 Black women, just to understand how self-silencing shows up for us. And through those interviews, she came up with a couple key themes that really resonated with me. The first theme was that self-silencing, by and large, is inherited, which, duh. If you are someone that self-silences, it's more likely than not that there's someone influential in your life that self-silences too. The second finding that she had was that Black women, we self-silence not only to maintain relationships, but we also self-silence as a coping strategy, particularly in environments that are racially conscious. So think about work, school, police interactions. Those are places where our tendency to silence ourselves shows up. And we do it in those settings for various reasons. Sometimes it is to succeed, right? If you are the agreeable person, folks are less likely to be intimidated by you. Sometimes we do it in those settings for safety. Other times we do it because we just don't want to be labeled as that contentious, angry Black woman, which is unsurprising. The other thing that stood out to me was the cost of self-silencing. So a lot of the women that she interviewed talked about how they deal with keeping everything bottled up. And some talked about overeating, some talked about just the inability to get up and do things and exercise. But Dr. Scott also looked at studies that looked at emotional suppression and how that shows up within your body, especially for us as Black individuals who have a concentrated amount of chronic illnesses that are brought on by stress. The other cost that she talked about that I can really relate to is around rumination. So in situations where you have something to say, you choose not to say it, it's likely that that moment sticks with you far beyond that initial interaction. And so the time and energy that you spend turning it over and over and over in your mind, that's a cost. It's a mental cost, and sometimes it even shows up physically. So Dr. Scott talked about within Black women, self-silencing as a coping mechanism. And that kind of led me to another study that was done by Dr. Camille Hall. She studied about 168 mother-daughter duos, and her central focus was on coping strategies for Black women. And my key takeaway from that study was that our coping mechanisms are largely inherited. So if your mother dealt with stress by being silent, it's more likely than not that you also deal with stress in that way. Now we know what self-silencing is and why we do it. How do we change it, right? Unfortunately, there isn't enough scientific evidence on how self-silencing can be reversed. So I'll share the strategies that I have used to be able to learn to speak up for myself more often. And the first one is just simply noticing it. And I know that sounds generic as hell, but when you are looking for it, like you'll be surprised, at least I was surprised how many times in a day that I have something to say and I choose to say nothing by choice and sometimes by fear. So by noticing it, I can choose whether or not I want to change or maintain that pattern. The second tip that has worked for me is practicing speaking up. So I started this channel to help women like myself who desire to make bold changes within their lives, but I also started it for me so that I can get comfortable hearing my own voice, so that I can reduce the anxiety that starts within my body whenever I know I have to speak up. So this is my exposure therapy to get comfortable taking up space so that when those moments arrive, I have evidence that I have done this before, and so I can do it again. And then the last is usually one that I employ when it's a really, really hard conversation, specifically in my intimate relationships. So whenever there's something hard that I have to say or I feel the need to advocate for myself, I try to remind myself of my values. And one of my core values is courage. It is essential to the way that I function, so much so that if I am not living in that value, I am not okay. So before any hard conversation, I try to remind myself of my value and the cost of not living in that. And usually that gives me the energy that I need in order to say what needs to be said. A couple years ago, I read a book, I can't remember the name or the author, so forgive me, but it essentially said that silence only guarantees that you continue to get the thing that you don't want. So it's in your best interest to speak up, right? So those three strategies are what I have used and I continue to use in order to get comfortable advocating for myself. Now I'd love to hear from you in the comments. If you are someone like me that has a tendency to suppress the way that you're feeling, I'd love to hear why. Also, if you are on the other side of it and you've learned new ways to change that behavior, let us know what has worked for you. You never know who you might be helping. So today we've learned all about self-silencing, what it is, why we do it, and what we can do differently next time. I hope you've enjoyed this series so far. And until next time, take care.